You're listening to the BBC World Service. This is Helena Merriman with The Inquiry. This week, should we give homeless people homes? In March this year, a video went viral. In just a few weeks, over 20 million people watched it. It told the story of how a city in Canada had ended homelessness.
I didn't believe it could be done, that you could solve a housing problem. And when you do solve it, everybody's across the entire continent is interested in this, and it's also proof that it can be done.
So, how did they do it? Well, it wasn't by treating addictions or improving shelters or finding people jobs. It was more simple than that. They gave the people living on their streets somewhere to live, a home. And if it worked in that city, we wanted to know whether it could work in others. So this week, we brought together 4 people who've devoted their careers to trying to end homelessness, as we ask, should we give homeless people homes?
Part 1. Housing First.
In the 1980s, I was working at Bellevue Psychiatric Hospital, which is on the east side of Manhattan, and I walked to work. It was just about 20 or 30 blocks.
This is Sam Tsemberis, a psychiatrist. He remembers well the moment when homeless people began to appear on American streets. The economy had tanked, housing was becoming less affordable, and state hospitals had released thousands of mentally ill people with nowhere to go.
I can't quite describe the shock of this because we've had homelessness now for some 30 plus years, but the first time that someone encounters a homeless person on the street, it's almost like when you walk with children. And they see somebody homeless, you might notice that children cannot really bring themselves to walk past another human being. It's like, what's wrong? What happened to this person? Why are they there? We as a public have lost a lot of that shock. But that's exactly what it was like in the early 80s.
And for Sam, there was an additional shock.
I began to walk past people that I recognized, people that I had actually treated when I was working on the inpatient service at the hospital. Somehow they had gotten discharged and the person was on the street, sometimes literally in their pajamas. It was quite disturbing.
So he'd go and talk to them. He'd tell them where the nearest shelter was, how to get treatment. But those he spoke to said they didn't want to go there. They were too crowded and they didn't feel safe. Time and again, he heard the same thing.
My problem is that I'm homeless. I need a place to stay.
But since many of them had mental health and addiction problems, they couldn't get one.
People had to participate in psychiatric treatment or be clean and sober in order to get housing. That was a precondition of the offer to housing.
So it was kind of a reward system. Stop drinking and you'll get a house.
It was absolutely a reward system. Some might call it a bit coercive as well, but it was something that was required of people in order to get housing. And curing addiction or curing mental illness is still something we don't know how to do. And that was exactly what was being asked of people in order to give them a place to live. It was an impossible hurdle to jump over.
Fed up with what he saw as a failing system, Sam Tsemberis left his job and started a charity. New research had just come out which showed that the majority of homeless people find somewhere to live in a few months, but around a fifth will be on the streets for over a year, and many of them have substance abuse problems or mental health issues. A name was given to describe this segment of the homeless population, the chronically homeless, and Sam Tsemberis and his charity focused on them.
And we began to do something that no one had really done before, which is to take people like the people I had met on the street and offer them a place to live no conditions other than sign the lease and pay your rent, be a good neighbor. But no treatment conditions, no sobriety, asking none of those kinds of clinical demands.
It was radical, counterintuitive, flying in the face of the well-established idea that a homeless person had to earn their way to a home. That first year, they gave 50 chronically homeless people somewhere to live. Some were expected to contribute to their rent. Others with no income got the flat rent free. They were given case managers to organise their treatment programmes, and Sam was often there when they gave them the keys to their home.
There's a bit of a disbelief and awe in the way people move into their first apartment. I mean, the joy is indescribable. Sometimes a feeling of like, is this for real? Is this for real? People talk about being able to sleep for the first time in years, the whole night, not with one eye open, being able to wake up and remember their dreams.
Tell me about the first person you gave a house to. What do you remember about them?
The first one that jumps to mind was this woman who was in her 50s. She had been homeless for years. She had many, many plastic bags. And the day we moved her in was remarkable. So what looked like just this pile of quite dirty plastic bags was actually a very well-organized system of things. So she took the bags that had her medicine, she walked to the bathroom and put all the stuff in the medicine cabinet. And the things that were clothing, now she had a dresser to put them into. She had photographs of family members, and she placed them around the apartment. It was quite beautiful and moving to watch her just go from carrying her whole life in these bags to actually having a home and making it manifest.
And what happened to her in the long term?
She got a lot of help. Her drinking considerably lowered. Her mental health improved just by the fact that she was in a secure place.
He says this is true of most of the people they gave homes to. While they didn't suddenly kick their addictions, they managed them better. What's more, they stayed off the streets.
At the end of the first year, 84% were still housed. 84% of people who had been on the street for years. We knew we were onto something very, very important.
Sam Tsemberis gave his new policy a name, Housing First. And to many, he'd worked a miracle. But there were some big questions. Was it fair that alcoholics and drug addicts be given a home? And how on earth would governments pay for all this housing? Time to introduce you to our second expert witness.
Part 2. A conversion.
Well, for me, it was a movie.
This is Philip Mangano, describing the moment he decided to dedicate his life to homelessness. He'd wandered into a cinema showing a film about St. Francis of Assisi.
I didn't know anything about St. Francis, but I have to say I went into that film thinking one way about the course my life would go. And I came out of that film wiping away the tears and thinking about a completely different way I could live my life.
He left his job to go and volunteer on the bread line at his local church. And he stood out from the crowd, often inviting homeless people into his house, and once leading a march to the local government offices after a homeless man froze to death. 20 years later, he received a call to serve as President George W. Bush's homelessness czar. He went to Washington, D.C., where one day an idea came across his desk.
I heard about a guy in New York who was actually placing people directly into housing off the streets. And frankly, I was completely agnostic that that could be done. But there I was in Washington. I thought, if that works, we better know about it.
So he flew to New York to meet our first expert witness, Sam Tsemberis.
And he took me to a number of people that had been housed, and it looked as though Sam had uncovered something that was in a blind spot for the entire issue for a quarter of a century. So I was interested in the tangible aspects of it, but actually I really wanted to look at the data and research. Was there confirming data and research that indicated that this approach worked?
And was there? Was there the data?
Yes.
By that time, a number of independent studies had been carried out. They showed that when you gave someone a home, the amount they used state hospitals reduced by 60%, and the number of days they spent in jail went down by 85%.
So it was a convert to Housing First.
A convert who now wanted to convert others. Mayors, governors, congressmen, senators, and, of course, the president. To do that, he had to answer one question.
How can we possibly afford to provide all of that housing for these people?
So he started to crunch the numbers. If he was going to spearhead a new policy, he had to compare the cost of Housing First to the costs of the old reward system, where homeless people wouldn't be given a home until they'd beaten their addictions.
How much did homeless people cost when they were randomly ricocheting through very expensive health and law enforcement systems, the emergency room of the hospital, police interventions, court costs, incarceration costs? How much did that cost versus how much did it cost for people when they were placed in housing? How much did the housing cost, the services cost, and then any other random ricocheting they were doing when they were actually in the housing?
He asked the mayors of cities all over the US these questions, and over 70 of them came back with answers.
Every single study that we did revealed that it was less costly to provide the housing and the services than it was to have those people randomly ricocheting in expensive health and law enforcement systems.
Since most of the chronically homeless had addiction and mental health problems, they were using services at a much higher rate than other homeless people. In and out of hospital and jail, they could cost up to $150,000 per person per year, whereas giving someone a home and access to services would cost, at most, $25,000. Armed with these figures, Philip Mangano had the attention of policymakers in Washington. The Department of Health gave the policy its seal of approval, and Philip Mangano got to work, convincing over 100 cities to adopt Housing First.
We set the goal in front of the country that we could end chronic homelessness. That is the homelessness of the most vulnerable, the most disabled, most likely to die on the street. We could end that form of homelessness in our country in 10 years.
And how many cities did end chronic homelessness?
We saw in the first 5 years about a 40% decrease in chronic homelessness around the country. Some cities, of course, performing amazingly. Denver, Portland, Seattle, Miami, New York, Philadelphia. There were a number of cities, but at this point, right now, I can think of only a couple of cities in the country that have actually ended chronic homelessness.
Are you disappointed by that?
Well, the recession hit, administrations changed. I think some momentum was certainly lost in that, and so you didn't have the same outcomes and results.
But was that the only reason some cities failed to get their homeless off the streets? Or was there something else going on?
Part 3. Trouble in the Tenderloin.
So I'm Josh Bamberger. I'm a family doctor in San Francisco. I've been taking care of homeless adults for about 26 years. And pretty much my only practice has been caring for people with severe mental illness, substance use, and chronic medical problems.
In the late 90s, San Francisco adopted a Housing First approach, and Josh Bamberger was part of it. It was a bold new program, and San Francisco was bold about what it could achieve.
We, like every other city in the United States, had a 10-year plan to end homelessness. And as I'm sure you're aware, homelessness still exists in San Francisco.
So what went wrong? Well, let's start with the homes they provided to over 10,000 homeless people. The majority of them were in an area called the Tenderloin.
So the Tenderloin is a densely populated area. So they're small apartments, 300 square feet. Sometimes the bathrooms are down the hall, and there are a lot of them. There are probably 1,000 or 1,500 of these buildings with 100 or 150 small apartments in them. It's loud. There's a lot of activity going on. There's a lot of drug dealing that goes on the streets.
Do you think that made a difference? Do you think that made it harder for then people to live in those flats and come off drink and drugs?
I think so. I think if you're struggling with sobriety and people are offering you drugs and alcohol on a regular basis, it's harder to make progress.
Many of the flats were in a poor condition too, and so some of the homeless people they housed drifted back to the streets. So that was failure number one, a failure they could have done something about. The second reason they struggled was less within their control.
We in San Francisco are in this very challenging conundrum where the cost to rent an apartment is beyond the means of low-income people. So the average cost of a studio apartment in San Francisco, and it's something like $2,500 a month. And if you're getting benefits from the government, the most you can make is about $950 a month. So that's just a huge gap that is never going to be overcome.
This had two consequences. First, it meant that when homeless people were given a home, even if they got a job, they couldn't afford to move into a new apartment and free up that first flat for another homeless person. Secondly, it meant there were many more homeless people on the streets competing for resources. And here's where the local authorities made another mistake.
We've housed the wrong people. We used our very limited local resources for people who are just low income. We didn't focus on the highest users of the healthcare system first.
As we've heard, it's the chronically homeless who cost governments the most money in emergency treatment or court costs. And so when you give them a home, those costs are reduced. By not prioritising those people, they weren't making the savings they could have been.
So what we should have done from the beginning is only offered housing first housing to the 20% of people who are chronically homeless.
Do you think that what's happened with Housing First in San Francisco tells us something about the limits of that approach in big cities where you have high rents and a very large number of homeless people?
Yeah, I think it shows some limits, but mostly it shows that when you have such great demand for limited resources, you need to be very exact and very courageous in only offering housing to the people who need it the most.
In other words, giving homeless people homes is the right policy, he says, but it only works if you implement it the right way, targeting the chronically homeless first and offering them flats in neighbourhoods that they might want to build a new life in. If you do all of that, what then? Can you really end homelessness?
Part 4. Miracle in Medicine Hat.
It's very flat. It's definitely green. It has a beautiful river valley running through the middle of it. There's beautiful walking trails. It's a very family-focused community.
Our final expert witness, Jamie Rogers, describing Medicine Hat, the Canadian city you heard about at the start of this inquiry that eradicated homelessness. Jamie Rogers was the woman who ran the housing project for the city.
I first heard about Housing First from a trip that I took to Toronto, looking at how many individuals they had housed off the streets there. Have to be really honest. After leaving that, I was probably one of the biggest skeptics that Housing First would actually work.
Like most people, she thought it sounded implausible, too good to be true. But she decided to give it a try. When she went back home, she found a place to live for a man called Dale, a homeless person who'd lost a limb after freezing outside. She saw how it changed his life and was an instant convert. And so 7 years ago, when the Canadian government decided to adopt Housing First, she came forward to help, and they began a Housing First project in Medicine Hat. Since then,
this community has collectively housed 1,013 individuals. So of that number, there are 705 adults that received housing and 308 children.
Unlike San Francisco, they carefully targeted the chronically homeless first.
Those that were in greatest need or those closest to death.
And, also unlike San Francisco, they had plenty of affordable homes.
What we did do was actually build those relationships with our landlords and property management and communities. We use market housing, so what's available to you or I as private renters in the community, and that's where individuals choose to reside.
And what did landlords say when you told them you wanted a homeless person to move into their flat?
And the landlords were worried about bed bugs, increased violence, and drug dealing. So we worked really hard to present factual information about who we actually serve. And we've actually seen quite the level of progress. We have 175 different landlord and property management companies on board with us now. And we have, finally, which is really exciting, we have landlords calling us.
So if I ended up on the streets of Medicine Hat tonight, what would happen to me?
If you chose to go to the shelter, you could spend one night in shelter and be speaking to a worker within 3 days maximum. If you came today, because it is Thursday, they would actually see you tonight at the shelter.
And how soon could I be on a waiting list for a home?
You could be on a wait list as quick as tomorrow.
So that's how Medicine Hat ended homelessness. And there are other cities all over the world which aren't far behind. Housing First has now been adopted in France, Denmark, Finland, Australia, Britain, Holland and Portugal. As in the US, it works faster in some cities than in others, but Sam Tsemberis, the founder of Housing First, says that with enough effort, it can work anywhere.
What we're talking about here is not the cure for Alzheimer's disease or the cure of a cancer. We know exactly how to treat this. The question worldwide is, are we committed to treating it?
As we've heard in this inquiry, giving homeless people homes has been shown not only to save money, but it's a better way of helping people manage their addictions and their lives. So, should we give homeless people homes? Yes.
The inquiry was presented by Helena Merriman. It was produced in London by Phoebe Keane. And that viral video we mentioned at the start of the programme was made by Now This News. If you have a question, we're on the World Service Facebook page. And on Twitter, we're at BBC The Inquiry.